It's 1974. The hottest new horror movie has been breaking box office records, but people have been running out of the cinemas halfway through, fainting in their seats, throwing up in the bathrooms, absolutely terrified and disgusted by what they've just seen on screen. Because The Exorcist isn't just another horror flick. According to the headlines, it was causing mayhem around the world, but it was just a movie, right? No, The Exorcist wasn't just a movie, and the novel that the film was based on wasn't just a novel either. It was actually inspired by the 1949 case of Roland Doe, an anonymous 13-year-old boy who went through a months-long ordeal that some believe was caused by demonic possession. Roland and his family endured terrifying poltergeist activity, words carved into the boy's skin, and harrowing episodes that witnesses, priests, and medical professionals couldn't explain. What makes this case so much more disturbing than the film is that several Catholic priests who were involved were convinced that they were battling something truly evil, an evil that was out there in the real world, and that had latched on to this young, innocent teenager. But where did it all begin, and what really happened to Roland Doe? First of all, Roland Doe is not the boy's real name, but for the longest time he was kept anonymous. The people in this case sworn to secrecy, and the boy was given a fake name to protect his identity. Sometimes he went by Roland Doe, other times Robbie Mannheim, but now his identity has actually come out in recent years. We know a lot more about him and his life before this ordeal. But for now, I will just refer to him by his pseudonym. Roland was born in 1935, and at the time he was living in Cottage City, Maryland, which is about half an hour out from downtown Washington, DC. And he was described as being quite a quiet, although intelligent boy. Roland was an only child to his parents Edwin and Odell, and had been raised as Lutheran, which is another branch of Christianity based on the teachings of Martin Luther. Not Martin Luther King, a bit before his time. Martin Luther was a monk who broke away from the Catholic Church in the 16th century. So the point to know is, Roland's family, they weren't Catholics, basically. And Roland, he was a typical teenager, though, when it came to school. He wasn't necessarily badly behaved, he was just quite unfocused, that sort of thing. And he also had a favourite aunt, a woman called Matilda Hendricks, who lived out in St. Louis, who was also nicknamed Tilly. And the story goes that Aunt Tilly was a spiritualist, and in the time that she spent with her nephew, she would talk to him about it. And she actually gave Roland a Ouija board, showed him how to use it, and they would conduct seances together, so it's said. But that is pretty much it for the background of Roland Doe that you need to know about for this story. Pretty unremarkable, no huge red flags here, right? But in early January 1949, when Roland was 13 years old, that would all change. Dramatically and violently. Similarly to how a lot of ghost stories start, the paranormal activity was initially very benign. Nothing too terrifying, more just perplexing. On the evening of the 15th of January, Roland and his grandmother Anna started to hear a dripping noise while they were both in Grandma's bedroom. Just like a leaky tap, just dripping continuously. They had a look around and just couldn't come up with an explanation to this noise. Nothing's leaking anywhere, like what's going on? As they were there, no further forward with answers, the picture of Jesus that was hanging on the wall started to shake, and it was jumping away from where it was fixed to the wall, as if someone was on the other side smacking the wall, and the shockwaves of that were bouncing the picture. After that, a scratching noise started from under the floorboards. All just very odd, not normal house noises settling or anything like that. And this scratching continued for a few nights, starting at around 7 p.m. and carrying on through until midnight, where it would just stop. No explanation, nothing has changed, the sound is just gone. The family brought in an exterminator, coming to the logical first conclusion that there must be a rat in the walls or under the floorboards or something like that, but the exterminator never found anything. No evidence of rodents, the traps he laid didn't stop the scratching. Things ramped up somewhat when Roland was in bed one night and he heard what he described as the sound of squeaking shoes walking up and down his room. But after all of this had been going on for a few days, just weird noises and things like that, the family were no further forward with answers when, on the 26th of January, Matilda, Aunt Tilly, passed away. She had multiple sclerosis and had died at the age of 54 years old. After the paranormal activity had started, it's important to add. But after Aunt Tilly died, the unexplained activity surrounding Roland didn't stop. Odell, Roland and Anna were all in his bedroom one night when they all heard what sounded like marching. There were marching feet and a beating drum. They claimed that the noise sounded like it was marching up and down Roland's mattress. There was nothing else to see, no invisible dents in the mattress with some ghost battalion walking along or something. There was just this noise. Okay, what? We're getting a little bit weirder now and a little bit too over-familiar, thank you, whatever you are. Odell, after obviously only very recently losing her sister-in-law, thought that maybe it was Aunt Tilly getting up to whatever it is that's going on in the house. And so she called out, saying that if it is you, Tilly, knock 3 times. There were 3 distinct knocks. Okay, Aunt Tilly, let's just be sure. Positively 4 knocks this time. Show us it's you. 4 loud knocks followed. Well, that was all the proof that Odell and Anna needed. It was Aunt Tilly. That's who's haunting the house and tormenting the family, specifically Roland. Just seemingly skipping over the fact that all of this had started 11 days before she had passed away. Okay. It didn't take long though for the activity to start getting more and more serious and harder to explain away. Furniture would slide across the floor, dishes and other small householdy bits would fly through the air, and when Roland was in bed at night, his mattress would start to violently shake with his bed covers ripped off. And they couldn't figure out how Roland could have been slamming his mattress on his own. He didn't seem to be grabbing it and bouncing up and down or anything like that. It just seemed so weird. Anything paranormal to do with being in bed at night, really not okay with. My bed is my safe place. It's where I look forward to being unconscious for 8 hours. If something I can't see starts shaking the mattress in the middle of the night, not okay with that. And as the weeks went by into late January, early February 1949, it soon started to extend outside of the house too. While he was at school, Roland's books would fly off his desk, and then sometimes even the desk itself would start shaking, just like his mattress, which had developed the nasty habit of doing the same on the regular. He was actually pulled out of school once the activity started there, just because they had no idea what was going on. But things were just getting way too much. We can't be talking about a rodent in the walls that's seemingly obsessed with our 13-year-old son at this point now. This is way bigger at this point. And so Roland's family started looking for more answers, taking him to doctors and psychiatrists. Surely there's a medical or psychological reason why this is happening, right? The medical professionals returned with a clean bill of health, and the psychiatrists, while they found that he was a bit high-strung and irritated by their questions, there was nothing neurological going on with Roland. And I think I would be a bit irate being questioned by a psychiatrist, going through all of this for a few weeks now, more than likely losing a not insignificant amount of sleep over it, and some guy with a clipboard is asking me what my relationship with my parents is like or something, that at the time just doesn't seem relevant when the dinner plates are hurling themselves across the room, you know? In more of a take this and see if it helps kind of move, rather than one grounded in a diagnosis, Roland was given an anti-epileptic medication, just in case he was having seizures, but they did nothing to stop the activity that was getting more and more severe, seemingly with each passing day. And so this, clearly, at least to the family, was not a medical issue. Roland wasn't sick, but still with no answers, they turned instead to their faith. If this was something paranormal, they were going to need the help of their minister, Reverend Luther Miles Schultz. He actually did have an interest in parapsychology, but while he did see strange things happen at the family home, things flying through the air, Roland's bed shaking while the poor kid's trying to get some sleep, he still thought there must be an explanation to all of this that's grounded in reality. I mean, we don't even know if Roland is just faking all of this, cleverly, somehow. Although the people closest to him had started to notice how his whole demeanour was changing. He was becoming more withdrawn, losing weight, obviously not sleeping. So on the 17th of February, Reverend Schultz took Roland to stay with him and his wife at their house. And this seems reasonable. If it is just a super elaborate hoax, take Roland off his home turf, see what he can get up to then. It's all soon gonna come out in the wash if it's just a prank. Wouldn't quite go that way. As they were getting ready to turn in for the night, Roland hopped into his bed and, just like at home, the mattress started violently shaking. Okay. The Reverend said, instead, Roland, why don't you try sleeping in the armchair instead? Just take you off the mattress completely. Just seeing if he would get a better night's sleep, but also take him off the mattress and see what happens. Within minutes, the big heavy armchair had been flipped over, throwing Roland out of it. Right, okay then. Well, let's put the mattress on the floor then, Roland. You can't fall any further than that, and let's see how that goes. Honestly, at this point, even if the Reverend is still suspecting that this is all just one huge prank, or even on the other end of the scale, that it's a poltergeist having a hearty good belly laugh at their expense, that's patience for you. So Roland gets on the mattress, lies down, when the mattress itself, with Roland on it, slides along the floor and stops underneath the Reverend's bed, and then then starts shaking violently. Schultz's flabbers were gasted. He had precisely zero idea what was going on with this poor boy, and knew that whatever it was, it couldn't help him. Instead, he advised the family to go to a Catholic priest. The Catholics, they know a lot more about this. They're who you need right now. And time was really becoming of the essence at this point. Roland was still clearly visibly struggling, but it was also around this time that whatever it was got really violent towards him, as Roland's body started coming out in red, angry-looking scratches. Their first port of call was Father Edward Albert Hughes, who was serving as an assistant pastor at St. James Catholic Church over in Mount Rainier, just a few minutes down the road from the family. He listened to what Roland had been going through, all the poltergeist activity, and now the attacks and things like that, and apparently observed the boy before praying with them all. He sent them on their way, though, after giving the family spiritual advice, as well as blessed candles and holy water, saying that if things get bad, burn the candles, sprinkle the holy water on the boy, just do all of those sorts of things. Apparently, Odell did just that one night when Roland had gone into one of these episodes where the activity is just all around him and they were just getting worse and worse by the day. The auntie was being upped all the time. She put the holy water down on the bedside table after sprinkling it and then watched as it flew across the room and smashed. Roland wasn't anywhere near it. There wasn't any explanation for what had happened. At this point, the 28th of February 1949, Roland was admitted to Georgetown University Hospital, which was affiliated with the Jesuit-run Georgetown University, so it had Catholic connections. He stayed there for a few days, undergoing further testing and evaluation, because don't forget, all throughout this, Roland isn't getting a wink of sleep, not really eating. You do that for a reasonable period of time, and you're gonna suffer for it. However, there is another story about something that happened to the boy here at this hospital involving Father Hughes. Apparently, Hughes had seen what was happening to Roland and could see how this malevolent energy was affecting him. And so he thought, this could be it. Roland could be a candidate for an exorcism. He went and sought permission from his superiors, including Archbishop Patrick O'Doyle of Washington, and once he had the green light, he began the exorcism on Roland, who had been restrained to the hospital bed to stop him from lashing out. As Hughes was reciting the rites of exorcism, Roland was thrashing and writhing around in bed in visible agony at the words that Father Hughes was saying. At one point, though, Roland slipped his arm out of one of the restraints. With some ungodly amount of strength, Roland tore into the mattress and pulled out one of the bed springs and used it to slash Father Hughes' arm from shoulder to wrist. That is a gnarly injury. Hughes was obviously in dire need of urgent medical attention after that, and so the exorcism was abandoned. And that particular story goes on to say that after Father Hughes had had the 100 stitches in his arm, while he was physically going to be okay, mentally he was not, and needed a long leave to recover psychologically, thus bringing an end to Hughes' involvement in Roland Doe's case. Which is all very sensational, isn't it? Digging into a mattress and pulling out a bed spring. That just defies explanation, surely. I'm not super familiar with hospital beds from the late 1940s, but would that even be possible? But aside from that, there is another problem with that story of the exorcism at Georgetown, because there's no evidence it ever took place. None. Nada. Not one iota. First of all, the records for Roland's hospital stay only mention the medical and psychological tests, nothing else. So he was there, but not for an exorcism. Which, the church would have wanted to keep the whole exorcism deal under wraps anyway, so could be the reason that it wasn't on his record. However, Father Hughes' records may be more enlightening, because throughout the summer of 1949, after this supposed exorcism took place, the priest was conducting weddings, christenings, all that sort of fun stuff. No leave of absence, no gap in his diary. He was straight back to work. And then people who were close to him, colleagues and whatnot, they had no recollection of what would have been a devastatingly serious injury. There aren't any medical records of Father Hughes getting stitches. No one remembers so much as him having a twinge in his arm, nothing like that. And then, perhaps most damning, a diary kept by one of the priests, who I will introduce you to shortly, and is what a lot of people consider to be a first-hand account of Roland Doe's exorcism. This diary explicitly states that Father Hughes never even met Roland. He met with his parents to give him the advice and the holy water and the candles and things, but was never in a room with Roland. Never saw the lad in person. So that part of Roland's story, that first exorcism attempt in Georgetown, has pretty much been debunked. But where did it come from? A story like that doesn't just appear out of thin air. It didn't even come from Hughes himself, himself, though. He never spoke publicly about that case. It was his assistant, Father Frank Bober. And Bober was very forthcoming to the press and things like that when all of this eventually came out, very willing to do interviews and all of this. And he was seen as a reliable source, a man of the cloth himself who was almost kind of connected to the case. He was even acknowledged as being a great help in Thomas B. Allen's 1993 book on the case called Possessed. And so some people think that this may have had something to do with the stories about Hughes that eventually got circulated, as Bober claimed that Hughes had confided in him about Roland's case and everything that went on, when in reality, based on the evidence we've got now, that doesn't look to have been entirely accurate, and it may have had more to do with Bober being a bit too happy to talk to the press. But all that aside, after Roland was home from Georgetown Hospital, after his tests, yet again couldn't find anything physically or psychologically wrong with him, his mom, Odell, just like the rest of the family, she was just at her wit's end, wondering what on earth was going on with her son, after yet again getting no answers from the men in white coats who were supposed to know. She apparently said in another room, separate to Roland, that maybe, I don't know, should we go back home? And by home she meant St. Louis, which was where they were originally from. That's where Edwin and Odell had met and got married, and they had family still living out that way. Maybe, I don't know, just having more family members around us, it's going to make this whole difficult time a little bit easier, you know? As Odell was saying this, that precise moment, Roland started screaming from the other room. Odell rushed in and saw that a word had been scratched in Roland's chest. Louis, spelt as in like St. Louis. Whatever it was that was afflicting the boy, it seemed to be in agreement with Odell. Yeah, you should take him to St. Louis. Just stepping back from the story a second though, this thing, whatever it is, I think it's fair to say that it's been a pretty not groovy time all around. If this is paranormal, it's the definition of a negative entity causing physical harm to the boy. Surely you shouldn't want to do what the not very nice entity is telling you to do? That like the entity is agreeing with you that it's a good idea? I don't know. Is that just me? The family though, they took it as a sign that yes, we should move back out to St. Louis and go and stay with Edwin's brother and his wife, Uncle Leonard and Auntie Doris. Not forgetting the fact that Aunt Tilly used to live in St. Louis before she died, and Odell was still convinced that this was all Tilly's doing. She was haunting Roland, and so that was another reason to go, to try and see if it put an end to it all. Roland and his parents moved to 8435 Roanoke Drive in Belnor, a suburb of St. Louis. It wouldn't be long before Edwin, the father, would go back home though, and to be honest, he's not really a part of this story at all. His job as the father was obviously to provide for the family, and you can't go losing your job in 1949, the post-World War II economy, so he didn't really have a lot to do with this anyway. But if moving across half the country may have given them a faint glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, what if the activity stops? That was quickly extinguished. The activity was just as bad in St. Louis as it had been at home in Cottage City. Odell had been thinking long-term about stopping in St. Louis, and so had floated the idea to her sister-in-law that maybe they should think about enrolling Roland in school here. Similarly to the initial St. Louis conversation, Roland started screaming from another room at that point. When they went in to see if he was okay, scratched on his chest were the words, "No school," with the word "no" being seen on his wrist a bit later on. The demon doesn't like hearing about Pythagoras and that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. I get it. But anyway, that put pay to any conversation of the boy attending school. The first night that they were staying there with Auntie and Uncle, Roland had been sharing a bedroom with his cousin, and they'd been tucked in for the night. Seemingly, suspiciously, everything had been all normal, but not for long though. The adults heard the boys crying out from the bedroom, and when they went to go and check on them, both of them were laid motionless on their beds, with the mattresses doing their trick of slamming up and down, before the actual beds started just sliding around the room. I think before that point, Doris and Odell would have most likely been having conversations about what was really going on at home, why they'd had to move out to St. Louis, and I'm sure Doris would have been a bit like, okay, yeah, sure. It all really just sounds like Rolly's acting up a bit, and maybe a change of scenery might do him good. But then to walk in and see that happening in your own home and affecting your own son, I can imagine that's going to make you feel a certain type of way. After that particularly eventful night, one of Roland's other cousins, she was attending St. Louis University, and being obviously rightly concerned about what had happened to her brother and Roland the previous bedtime, she went and saw one of the faculty members who was a Jesuit priest, Father Raymond Simon J. Bishop. He listened to everything the cousin told him, all about the poltergeist activity that was getting more and more violent, the scratches, how it was all physically affecting the boy, all of it. After hearing this poor lad's ordeal, he agreed to come and observe Roland to see for himself what was going on. On the 9th of March 1949, Father Bishop arrived at the home on Roanoke Drive, and it didn't take long to see that the cousin hadn't been exaggerating. Roland was in bed, with the mattress doing its thing all around him, jumping up and down with seemingly a mind of its own, and he couldn't come up with an explanation as to how Roland could be doing that himself, just like no one before him could. Father Bishop did the only thing he could think to do in that instance though, and sprayed the bed with holy water. What do you know? The mattress stopped moving. Okay, so are we on to something here then? Father Bishop walked out of the room and left Roland in peace with his family, but no more than 15 minutes later, Roland started screaming. Big, red, nasty scratches were zigzagging all across his body. People had remained in the bedroom with him after Father Bishop had stepped out. Everyone claimed that he couldn't have done that to himself. They would have seen him do it. And so that was kind of it for Father Bishop. He had no inclination that Roland was the type of boy to have been making all of this up just to cause trouble. Demonic possession, it comes in a few different stages. And so what he'd heard all about the goings-on in Maryland, the poltergeist activity, that was the start. Demonic infestation. The scratches right now, Roland had moved to the next stage, demonic oppression. And so you know what the next stage is? A full-on demonic possession. The day after the visit, Father Bishop went to one of his closest friends, Father William S. Bowden, to discuss what had happened. And Father Bowden, he had served in World War II as a chaplain. He was a very level-headed guy, calm under pressure, experienced with helping people deal with problems, all the things that you'd value in your exorcist, you know? Father Bowden listened to what Father Bishop told him, and a few days later, both men visited the house in Belnor to check in on Roland. It was about 10 o'clock at night, so pretty late. Not that that had anything to do with it, really. It wasn't to set the scene for a paranormal investigation or anything like that. It was just that Father Bowden was super busy with his own commitments. They chatted with Roland and the family before sending him off to bed, which was, yet again, the time when the activity started. Both Father Bowden and Father Bishop witnessed more scratches appearing on Roland's body, in the shape of a cross this time, so they said prayers over him and that was that. It did seem to help somewhat. But even Father Bowden now, he was starting to see what Father Bishop had been telling him about. There was something going on here, and I don't know, it seemed demonic. They went away and produced a report on Roland's case, as they were putting together everything they needed to ask permission from the church to perform an exorcism on the boy. Clearly, just blessing the teenager, the family, and the house wasn't cutting it anymore. They needed the big guns. Father Bowden went to seek permission, but he did say that he didn't want to do it himself. He was cool, calm, and collected, and he was experienced in his duties, but he had no idea the first thing about exorcisms, specifically how to perform an exorcism. I think this boy needs an exorcism, but he needs someone who also knows what they're doing for said exorcism. The church came back to him and said, yep, agree, this boy needs our help, but you've got to do it, I'm afraid. Because the thing about performing exorcisms, yeah, the priests do get training, but most of the experience comes from that good old on-the-job learning. And so Father Bowden was just gonna have to learn as he was going along. The church also gave permission on the condition that the whole thing be kept completely under wraps. Under no circumstances were outsiders to find out what was going on. This was a need-to-know basis only. However, having no experience himself and seeing this as an opportunity for others who came after him to learn, Father Bowden asked Father Bishop to keep a diary of everything. All the context leading up to this point, so what happened before the family came out to St. Louis, everything Roland had been through, and then everything that was gonna come after it. And that's the diary that I spoke about earlier, where Father Hughes's involvement, or lack thereof, was written about. Roland, he wasn't in a great state, but they knew that they were gonna need multiple people in that room to hold him down. Father Bowden had been studying other cases, and these things always seemed to turn violent. And so he enlisted other Jesuit priests and seminarians, basically students who are in training to become a priest. One of those was Walter H. Halloran, who would later go on to qualify and become Father Halloran. He was 27 years old at the time and was a huge ex-football player, i.e. big and strong enough to hold Roland down during the exorcism. And so by the 16th of March 1949, they were ready to start. The priests had to work under the cover of night, partly because it was supposed supposed to be a secret, but also because they had other commitments in the day. I guess you can't really block out time in your diary saying you're gonna go and attend an exorcism. Push back that christening at 2 p.m, I gotta go fight demons at that time. Father Bowden, Father Bishop, and other priests who were available that particular night would visit Roland in the Belnor house every single night, reading out the exorcism rites for hours on end while the poor boy was writhing and screaming at them. It would look like he'd gone into a trance or a seizure or something. He'd be thrashing around with unnatural strength, having to be held down by 3 grown men. They were full on doing battle with the devil, trying to save Roland's soul. He would spit at them, mock their prayers by speaking in Latin back to them, even though his family claimed that he knew no Latin, and some say that he also urinated on them as well. All the while, these big angry scratches would continue to appear on his skin, when according to the priests, he had been restrained. There's no way that he could have got free to inflict them on himself. During one of the rituals, Roland started to complain that Father Halloran was holding him too tightly. It was hurting him. It sounded genuine, and so Father Halloran just eased up his grip on the boy's arm, just a touch. Well, that was enough. All of a sudden, Roland broke completely free from Father Halloran and clocked him square in the face, breaking his nose. But that wasn't the only trick that the supposed demon would play. Another time, the priests were reciting the prayers, and Roland started to look like he was about to be sick. They let him sit up, choking on your vomit isn't going to be a good look. And at that point, Roland asked them to open up the window. Is this it? You're going to vomit out the demon and you need the window open so you can expel it out of the house? The priests were hopeful. As soon as the window was open, a super strong gale-like wind started whipping around the room, and Roland started screaming that he was going, the demon was leaving. They'd cracked it. The exorcism was working. Yeah, no, unfortunately not. It's a trick that apparently happens quite a lot in exorcisms. The alleged demon inside the afflicted person will pretend that the exorcism is working and fake leaving so that the priests stop and the demon can get back to business of possessing and such. They were a good few nights into it by this point, and so they wanted to try a new tack. They thought, what about taking Roland out of the house? Maybe new scenery might help? I don't know, it's worth a shot. They initially moved the nightly exorcisms to the rectory for the St. Francis Xavier Church, but the problem was, it was on the St. Louis University campus. And what is the most nocturnal creature there is? That's right, university students. Those were the days, staying in the library well past midnight, knowing full well that it was a 50-50 chance whether you were going to make it to 9 a.m. lectures the morning after. Not that I did that at all, I attended all of my 9 a.m. lectures. But the problem in this case was that people walking past the rectory could hear what was going on. Priests shouting in Latin, a 13-year-old boy screaming. Just ain't ideal, They moved back to Roland's aunt and uncle's house in Belnor for a time, but with the way that these exorcisms and seemingly Roland's possession was going, it just wasn't safe. The priests needed him under more control, so he wasn't a danger to others, poor Father Halloran's nose, or himself. So he was eventually moved to a secure room in the psychiatric wing of the Alexian Brothers Hospital in St. Louis, just about 20 minutes away from Belnor. It didn't matter though where they moved into, what they did, it didn't seem like anything was working. On the 1st of April, 17 days after the priest had started performing the rite of exorcism each night, they decided, let's try baptizing Roland as a Catholic. A baptism is kind of a little bit of an exorcism in itself. You're renouncing Satan and casting out anything unclean, so, again, worth a shot, right? And a baptism, not that I have any personal experience with them, but they're meant to be this happy, joyous occasion. You're being delivered from the power of evil, you're being prepared to receive God's grace. It's a happy thing. Only for Roland, and most definitely the priests present, it was anything but. It was just like any of the other nights that they've spent with the boy. Cue more screaming, thrashing, and just an unpleasant time all around. On top of that, it didn't stop Roland's suffering, and so continued the nightly battles until the 18th of April 1949, Easter Monday. As had become the routine, the rites were being recited, Roland was still having violent seizures, taunting and swearing at the priests. He'd swing his fists at them, snap his teeth, and woe betide if they got too close with how they were restraining him, he would actually bite them. But this time, just after midnight, another voice came through Roland, one that the priests hadn't heard before. This wasn't the boy's voice, and it wasn't the demonic-sounding growls that had been heard before. The voice coming through Roland started shouting, "Satan, Satan, I am Saint Michael, and I command you, Satan, and all other evil spirits, to leave this body in the name of Dominus, immediately, now, now, now." The priests were too stunned to speak. Everything fell silent, and Roland quickly came around from his trance. He looked around at the men in the room with him and said to them, calm as anything, "He's gone." He went on to say that he'd had this vision of a man with a flaming sword, beating back the monsters, almost like Roland had been seeing Saint Michael, the archangel, defeating the demon. Before anyone could do anything else, a booming thunderclap noise reverberated through the entire psychiatric ward, like the sky itself had cracked open inside the building. Nurses who were working on the ward, who obviously didn't know the specifics of what was going on inside that room, rushed to Roland's bedside, thinking that someone had been shot with a gun or something. But nothing was broken, no one was harmed, everything was as it should have been. It was almost as if it had signified that the whole ordeal was over. The demon had gone. Roland stayed in the hospital for a short time afterwards for observation, but there were no more scratches, no more outbursts, no more mattresses with a mind of their own, nothing. And so Roland was discharged. The family moved back home to Maryland not too long afterwards, and after a few weeks had passed, Roland wrote a letter to Father Bowden, saying that he was totally okay and thanking him for what him and the other priests had done. And so even though the church had wanted this whole thing kept under wraps, the case did appear in the newspapers with an article on the 19th of April claiming that a boy had been freed from demonic possession. There were a few more articles here and there, but it was never a big deal. It never really got a huge amount of attention at the time. But one of those articles was in the Washington Post, and a student at Georgetown University saw it and was rather intrigued. "Unnamed boy delivered from evil by exorcists." That would 100% be enough to get me to read the article. But anyway, this student's name was William Peter Blatty. Recognise that name? You should. We chatted about him last episode. Time went on, he graduated uni and went on to start his career in writing, but he could never get that case of Roland Doe out of his head. And so eventually, in the late 60s, he decided that he was going to write a novel about it and call it The Exorcist. Dun, connecting all the dots. He managed to get his hands on a copy of Father Bishop's diary, which would have been a feat in itself. There really weren't that many of them out there. But he was also able to have a conversation with Father Bowden himself. The priest, though, true to his word to the church, didn't discuss the case with Blatty. But what he did tell him was that to his mind, the case that he was involved in was the real thing. He had no doubt about it then, and he has no doubt about it now. And so that is how we have the novel The Exorcist, which was published in 1971. And then subsequently the movie, which was released on Boxing Day in 1973, with a whole host of weird goings on. So if you haven't watched the last episode where we talk about the curse attached to the movie, do yourself a favour and go watch that one after this. Blatty ended up changing details to keep Roland's identity as secret as possible. The 13-year-old boy became a 12-year-old girl. The location was mainly in Georgetown rather than Maryland or St. Louis. And then obviously things were fictionalised to make it the iconic horror we know today, but also no one died as a result of Roland's possession and exorcism. But once the movie was released and word started to spread that the story was actually based on a true case of demonic possession, people obviously wanted to know the details. And so using clues from the newspaper articles at the time of the exorcism, how the unnamed boy had been born in 1935 and the area where he had lived and things, eventually people started to piece together the clues. There was one guy, Mark Opsnasnick, who really dug into the records, high school yearbooks, church memberships, and found the identity of one person who fit the criteria. And so I saw somewhere that said that everyone researching the case after this point is standing on the shoulders of Mark's research, which I thought was a really nice way of putting it. But there were other people involved too, piecing everything together, including a guy called Troy Taylor, who wrote the book The Devil Came to St. Louis, and he actually spoke to the anonymous Roland Doe. In his interview with Roland, who still didn't want to be named, he didn't want his identity out there, he said that he didn't really have anything to say about the exorcism itself. He didn't really remember a lot of it, but he remembered the priests, the hospital beds, all of that. On the 10th of May 2020 though, Roland Doe passed away from a stroke, about a month before his 85th birthday, and after that, his true identity was revealed. His name was actually Ronald Edwin Hunkeler. Can we just take a moment for that pseudonym though, please? Just swapping the N and the L around. Ronald becomes Roland. Yeah, that's different enough. That'll keep him anonymous. And then also just to point out, the other names I used in this story up until this point, they were the real names. Edwin and Odell, they were Ronald's parents. Leonard and Doris, they were his aunt and uncle. After the exorcism, Ronald, as I will now refer to him as, he had gone on to have a happy, normal life. He'd grown up, got married, had kids, even had a job as a rocket scientist. Literally, he worked for NASA for 40 years up until his retirement in 2001. He even had a patent in his name that was granted on the 7th of May 1968 for insulating technology that helped panels withstand extreme heat. So he had had a fulfilling career. And so you can understand it from his perspective why he wouldn't want his past getting out. He wouldn't want his colleagues at NASA to find out that he was Roland Doe, the boy who was possessed by a demon in the 40s. But it wasn't just Ronald's true identity which eventually became known. The house in Belnor, where the priests had performed some of the exorcism rites, people figured that out too, and the house itself is still standing now. Unsurprisingly, it has become a bit of a destination for people to go and check out the infamous exorcism house. Not that I'm condoning that. From what I can see, the current owners of the place aren't thrilled by the attention, but the stories around this place are that there is still something there left over from when Ronald and the priests were going through this diabolical ordeal. His aunt and uncle, Doris and Leonard Hunkeler, they stayed in the house for 2 more years after the exorcism, but apparently Doris claimed that things were never the same again. Objects would be thrown around the house, doors would open and close by themselves. It just seemed like some of the energy had lingered after Ronald had been moved to the hospital. But the Ghost Adventures crew, they were actually able to go inside the house and do one of their ghost hunts in what was their 100th episode. And they spoke to another paranormal investigator who said that he had been attacked and his neck had come up in blisters in the room where the exorcism happened. And a neighbour who lived nearby claimed that the house had had a few owners, no one ever really stayed super long, and it never seemed to end very well, with divorces and things, and so it had actually stood empty for a lot of the time. There just seemed to be a vibe around the house that wasn't super great. But it wasn't just the house on Roanoke Drive either. There were stories about the hospital where Ronald had stayed and where the exorcism had finally been completed. After Ronald had been discharged and he was about to go forth and live happily ever after, the nurses who were working on the psychiatric ward started to notice strange things happening around the room that he had been restrained in. I think they had kept it locked after the exorcism, they hadn't used the room again, but they said that there was a black spot that appeared above the bed. No matter how much they cleaned or even painted over it, it wouldn't disappear. Whenever they walked past the room, they would get a cold chill from the doorway, even though there weren't any windows open, no drafts coming under the door or anything like that. But they would also hear disembodied voices in there, having hushed conversations, even when no one was around. The Alexian Brothers Hospital was torn down between 1976 and 78 though, and so they actually cleared out the furniture from the room where the exorcism happened, so they could lock it away, so it wouldn't be mistakenly used anywhere else again. Inside an old desk that had come from that room, there was a copy of Father Bishop's notes. And when they got to demolishing the infamous exorcism room, the workers claimed to see something black crawling out of the room just before the wrecking ball hit it. They said it was like a cat or a huge rat or something, which yeah, could have been a rat living in the walls of the old hospital maybe, but they never saw anything like that again while they were going through the rest of the demolition, never had a rat problem or anything like that. But it all led some people to believe that just like the house in Belnor, there had been something left over at the old hospital. But then there was a claim made, let's say, in the Discovery Plus documentary called The Exorcism of Roland Doe, and in it, Stephen LaChance, who wrote another book on the case called Confrontation with Evil, was interviewed. He said that the demon didn't just leave Ronald and that was that, it was all sunshine and rainbows, everything's all good. He said that the demon left Ronald, but it entered one of the priests who was present on the 18th of April, the final day. He doesn't name the priest, but he went on to say that he was given access to a mental hospital, doesn't mention the name of that hospital either, and he was shown to a locked door of a room in the empty psychiatric ward. He wasn't allowed to go in, but when he put his ear to the door, he could hear the sounds of furniture being thrown around the room, things smashing about. It sounded like someone was having a party, full on raid room style in there. The story goes that this unnamed priest, with the demon still inside of him, ended up locked in this mental hospital until his death in 1983. As far as I can see, there is no proof for this part of the story. Even Troy Taylor, who had interviewed a bunch of people involved in the case, including Ronald, he had no idea. I saw in a later interview that Troy did that he'd said that the documentary airing, that was the first time he'd heard about that, that. Never, in his decades of research, had he come across anything like that being claimed. So until more historical record comes out about that, it's gonna get a bit of an eyebrow raise from me. But then, considering the end of Blatty's novel, The Exorcist, where Father Karras sacrifices himself to save Regan from Pazuzu, did he take inspiration from this little-known part of the story? Did he have access to a copy of Father Bishop's diary where maybe that part hadn't been redacted or something? Maybe someone mentioned that there was a priest who was in a psychiatric facility as of the early 70s when Blatty was writing this novel. As obviously, if the priest died in 1983, that would have been before both the novel and the movie came out. Or is it all just a coincidence and Blatty wrote Father Karras' death as a fittingly shocking end to his horror novel? By extension of that, maybe, did that story of the priest sacrificing himself and going into a mental hospital come about after the movie? And so kind of took inspiration from the theme of Father Karras' sacrifice? Because that is what The Exorcist did very well. It was shocking. And when you look at the reference material, the case of Roland Doe, Ronald Hunkeler, you can see where at least some of that shock factor came from, can't you? It's an utterly unbelievable case. But demonic possession, really? Was this a bona fide, paranormal case of an innocent boy being taken over by the devil or something else, something malevolent or evil? The church have remained pretty much silent on the whole thing, never saying whether it was or wasn't a real case of possession. The priests who were there, though, that's a different story. A lot of them, just like Father Bowden, they never spoke publicly about the case, aside from Father Bowden telling Blatty that he had thought it was real. But there was apparently a document, kind of like a statement, an affidavit kind of thing, which allegedly contained the signatures of 48 people, including 9 Jesuit priests who witnessed the possession and the exorcism for themselves at one time or another. And all of them believed that what they had witnessed was true. Father Halloran, he actually did some interviews, and the impression seemed to be that while he did harbour some skepticism, there were things about Ronald that he couldn't explain. He wasn't going to go all out and say it was demonic possession though, you know? Troy Taylor also got the opportunity to interview Father Greg Holowinski, another priest who had been present at the exorcism. He had been suffering from terminal cancer, and he felt that it was about time that he talked about what he had experienced before he passed away in 2014. He said that one time he was holding Ronald's ankles, restraining him so that Father Bowden could perform the rites, and he saw the boy levitate off the bed. This wasn't a, oh, it looks like he's levitating, he might be levitating. Father Holowinski had seen this 13-year-old boy levitate 12 inches off the bed. Regardless of what it was though, these priests saw a tormented boy who needed their help, and so that's what they delivered, whether it was demonic or not. As some people didn't read the situation as demonic possession, they read it more as a poltergeist. It started in the same way as poltergeist cases usually do. There was a kid in the family going through puberty. It started small, the scratching, the footsteps, the small objects being thrown around, and then it escalated, turning violent. And then, like other poltergeist cases, the activity just stopped or scaled right the way back down. But then on the other side of the fence, there's a healthy argument that the whole thing was just not real. There was nothing paranormal going on whatsoever. I know it was 1949 and the church had wanted to keep it as secret as possible, but there's no evidence of any of the paranormal claims outside of Father Bishop's testimony in his diary. No photos, no recordings, anything like that. So that's already a big red flag. Mark Opsnasnick, as part of his research into Ronald's true identity, he interviewed friends and neighbours and built this picture of a boy who would be a bit of a prankster. He would throw tantrums, things like that, and he didn't really like school. And so did Ronald concoct this whole thing just to get out of school? If he could get his parents to move to St. Louis, that's well away from his school, so he wouldn't have to go. But then when the conversation started about sending him to a St. Louis school, scratch marks appeared which suggested the demon was violently against that idea. I mean, it does seem like a bit of a strange thing for a demon to get heated about, you know? Just imagining this evil, inhuman entity as old as time itself, who has possessed a young boy and is now huffing and crossing its arms because they don't want to go to school. But then just with the scratches themselves, witnesses claimed that they never saw Ronald scratch himself. They always seemed to just appear. But I guess there's nothing to say that he didn't scratch himself before they came into his bedroom, and then he just cried out once they were in there with him, by which time the skin had already gone red and angry, maybe broken a little if the scratch is deep enough. Do you know what I mean? mean? But then, I don't know, it just seems a bit much for a prank. Even a prank that got out of hand, right? Ronald wasn't sleeping, he was losing weight, and then he was going through the nightly ritual of being pinned down on a bed and having priests shout prayers over him. That is a lot. For all this to be going on over the span of 3 months. It just seems like a lot of work, a lot of input on his part just to miss a few months of school or whatever. So then the potential explanation of something medical comes up. I mean, yes, they did exhaustive testing on Ronald at the time, but they don't have the tests that we do now. They maybe wouldn't have been able to recognise mental illnesses like they can now. So maybe there's something there. But one thing that is worth mentioning is a long-term companion of Ronald, anonymous, unnamed, unverifiable of course. They said that Ronald had told them about the exorcism case, and he'd said, apparently from his mouth himself, he'd made the whole thing up. He was just a bad boy. It might explain why he wanted to keep it hidden throughout his life, but like I say, being an unverifiable source that claims to be a long-term companion, we've got no way of knowing for sure whether he actually said that or not. And so, the Exorcist movie shocked audiences, with many refusing to watch it even to this day, but the true story behind it was all the more disturbing. Not because of any theatrics, no spinning heads, no battle to the death with evil itself, but because behind closed doors, there was a real boy, a real family, and real people who believed that they were facing something otherworldly, something far beyond their understanding. Whether it was demonic or not, paranormal or psychological, what happened to Roland Doe, Ronald Hunkeler, was a living nightmare, one that dragged on for months, left priests physically and emotionally scarred, and turned the Hunkeler household upside down in the spring of 1949. They had been an ordinary family, and that's what makes it so unsettling, because if it could happen to them, could it happen again? And as of right now, 2025, there is no one left alive who witnessed this exorcism, so there is no way of knowing the full story. Unless, of course, you are a firm believer that Ronald did make the whole thing up, which, in that case, that is totally fair enough. I completely see where you're coming from. I just think, even for a 13-year-old boy who really hates school, the 3 months this went on for is a long time to keep convincing the adults around you that it's real. It's a lot of activity to fake, objects moving, the mattress, the scratches, every night. So maybe it is a medical condition or some sort of psychosis, but that doesn't seem to fit quite right either. Why, after 3 months, did he just snap out of it, completely went away and that was the end of it? He never suffered anything else again in his life. It's an interesting one for me. I don't necessarily believe it, but there are just a few questions floating around that keep me stuck from outright denouncing it as nothing more than a kid wasting everyone's time and causing a scene. I think that the influence that the mother and grandmother had was largely downplayed in the diary, at least. In what I've read, it comes across that they were very overbearing, smothering this only child, and they were both deeply religious too. I definitely think that could come into play somewhere in the mix there, but it is pretty damning that the so-called long-term companion claimed that Ronald said that he'd made it all up, if you believe the anonymous source that came out after he'd died, of course. It would have been interesting if we could peek into another reality and see how the case would have played out if religion hadn't been involved. If, like the Enfield poltergeist in the 70s, something like the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research, got involved instead, and from there studied the poltergeist activity and the interactions with Ronald in a more sceptical manner and seeing what they found instead. Or turning it on its head, what if Catholic exorcists had attended the Enfield house and attempted to exorcise Janet? I think it brings up a wider conversation about how belief systems feed into these cases, because there are so many angles to the case of Roland Doe. There's a lot of speculation out there, so while this one was incredibly interesting to put together, it was rather difficult to put the pieces in the right place. Something I did find interesting though was that the real case seemed to have been influenced after the fact by the novel and the movie at some points. According to Troy Taylor, he said that the first reference to Aunt Tilly's Ouija board came from the 70s, after the movie had come out. No one had mentioned Ronald playing with a Ouija board before that, wasn't in the priest's diary or anything like that. No one claimed that that was the reason that the boy got possessed. But you just need to step back and take a look at it from a narrative point of view when you're William Peter Blatty putting together a fictional story. You need a catalyst for the character to get into the conflict conflict that they're going to be resolving through the story. Ronald Hunkeler didn't have a discernible catalyst to this supposed possession. Even Aunt Tilly, she had died after the activity started. So I just thought that that was a really interesting example of how you definitely shouldn't believe everything you read. Take everything on with a pinch of salt and form your own conclusions from the information presented to you. Because bottom line for me, I think there were too many points that contradicted a demon in the biblical sense. I'm not religious anyway, but I do believe in positive and negative energy and intention and things like that. I do believe that people can be affected by negative energies, and maybe that was what was going on here. Perhaps it was a poltergeist case that just got out of hand and there was something paranormal. But with Ronald having a bit of a history of messing about, being a bit difficult, highly strung, it's really hard to say that with much confidence. But I really think that your conclusions on this one are just going to come down to your own belief systems and how much you trust the testimony that's been presented to us. But come on, that's what makes all of this so interesting. Everyone is going to have a different perspective, so please share yours in the comments and maybe have a read of a few others too. You wonderful lot are always so insightful and respectful in the comments section, and I really appreciate that. But if you enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button. We've been on a bit of a journey together, haven't we? I'm going to be back next week with another story. You Disney fans are going to absolutely love it, I'm hoping. But if you haven't already and you've enjoyed listening to me chat about demons and ghosts and scary movies, maybe you'd like to do this again sometime, and so you'd want to subscribe too. But anyway, that is all from me today. Go get a drink of water, stay hydrated, your soul may be safe, but your kidneys still need the help. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. Gotta stop because the dog's having a drink right behind me. Okay, now we can carry on.